Well, hello once again, and welcome to our third talk, in which I'd like to address three topics. The first two form part of the literary approach that I've been using. Remember, at the beginning I noted there are four main actors in Mark's story of Jesus. Jesus himself, the disciples, the opposition, and the little people, the minor characters. We've looked at Jesus and the disciples, and now I'd like to look at the opposition and the little people. And then to conclude our time together, I'll go back to the Passion and Resurrection, which again picks up Jesus and the disciples. So we'll start with the opposition. In the main, those who oppose Jesus and seek to make life difficult for him are the scribes, the Pharisees, and the priestly aristocracy of Jerusalem. The scribes are the legal experts of Israel, the scholars, the rabbis. They were really the religious leaders of the people, respected and very influential. The Pharisees are a fairly broad group with no particular membership requirements except a serious commitment to the law and a concern to apply it to their daily lives. And within them there was a group called the Habarim, like a guild of friends or associates who were very strict and who pledged to keep the law really precisely. In Jerusalem there was the high priest, members of the priestly families, and the lay aristocracy. These were the real power brokers in Israel, and the high priest was always a Roman appointee. Two other groups mentioned in the story are the Sadducees, who were members of the priestly aristocracy and who were theologically a rather conservative group, and the Herodians, who were the political supporters of Herod the Tetrarch. Now, the way Mark handles the issue of opposition to Jesus is to present the reader with two main blocks of material, usually referred to as controversy stories. The first is found early in the narrative, chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3, and the second during Jesus' final week in Jerusalem, chapters 11 and 12. But really, Jesus' whole ministry was punctuated with controversy, and there are several incidents at different points throughout the story to remind us of this. So let's briefly examine the first block. Notice that it isn't that Jesus has a particularly bad day, moving from one crisis to another. No, Mark has brought together in a literary unit several controversies which could have occurred at different times and in different places. The setting for the first controversy is the healing of the paralysed man, or rather the fact that, as well as curing the man, Jesus forgives his sins. And the scribes are unhappy with this, as only God can forgive sin. So they believe that Jesus is blaspheming. But the Son of Man, says Jesus, has authority on earth to forgive sins. The second issue is the fact that at Levi's party, Jesus is eating with people whom the religious elite considered to be sinners. And it's the scribes, again, who complain, asking why Jesus does this. And he replies, a little ironically, I think, that a doctor comes to attend to the sick and not to those who think they're healthy. The third problem arose from the fact that the Pharisees and also the disciples of John the Baptist used to fast regularly, whereas Jesus and his disciples didn't. Why not? Jesus' reply is a little enigmatic. Wedding guests don't fast when the bridegroom is with them. However, they will fast after the bridegroom has been taken away. And the bridegroom is a messianic image. The fourth issue has to do with Sabbath observance. The disciples of Jesus are plucking heads of grain as they walk through the cornfields. This time it's the Pharisees who are critical. And Jesus reminds them of what David did and makes that amazing statement: the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Son of Man is a term that Jesus often used when referring to himself. Finally, in this block of material, Jesus is in the synagogue on another Sabbath, and there's a man present with a withered hand. And the Pharisees are watching to see whether he'll cure on the Sabbath, which they considered to be against the law. They're really out to get him here. And some scholars wonder whether the man was really a plant. Jesus calls the man out into the middle of the assembly and asks whether on the Sabbath one should do good or do harm. And the Pharisees refuse to answer, and he's quite annoyed with them. But he does good by curing the man. And then the Pharisees go out and join the supporters of Herod, and the two conspire how to destroy him. So from now on, as Mark's story unfolds, Jesus lives under the shadow of the cross. Moving on, soon afterwards, the scribes come down from Jerusalem and accuse Jesus of casting out devils through the power of Satan. Basically, they're saying that he is himself devil-possessed. And Jesus turns the tables on them by commenting that a kingdom divided itself cannot stand. It's impossible. So their criticism doesn't make any sense, really. Later on, after the feeding of the 5,000, some Pharisees and some Jerusalem scribes approach Jesus. They've noticed that Jesus' disciples didn't wash their hands before eating. And they ask why the disciples don't live according to the traditions of the elders. And here Jesus quotes the prophet Isaiah to them. They honour God with their lips, but their hearts are far from him. And he goes on to teach that defilement doesn't come from outside a person, but it comes from what is in our human hearts. Later, after the feeding of the 4,000, some Pharisees come up and argue with him, demanding a sign from heaven to authenticate his ministry. And Jesus refuses because he's already given so many signs that he comes from God, and they just refuse to see. The next block of controversies is located in the final week of Jesus' life, after he's entered Jerusalem on what we now call Palm Sunday, though there's no mention of palms in Mark, it's only in John's Gospel. On the following day, Jesus enters the temple and drives out those who are buying and selling, overturning the tables of the moneylenders, quite a dramatic prophetic gesture. The day after that, as he's walking in the temple again, he's challenged by the chief priests, the scribes, the elders, the real power guys, asking where he gets the authority to do these things. In reply, he asks them a question: whether John's baptism came from men or from God. Quite a clever question, which really puts them on the spot. And since they realise that, they refuse to give an answer. So he too refuses. He then tells the parable in which the owner of a vineyard leases it out to tenants. And at the time of the harvest, he sends a slave to get the produce, but they beat him up. The same happens to the next one he sends. And then a third envoy is actually murdered. And finally he sends his son. So the tenants decide to kill him so that they would inherit the vineyard. And the religious leaders realise that this parable is aimed at them. And they want to arrest him. But they're afraid of the crowd because they respect him as a prophet. And so they exit for the time being. Then the Pharisees and Herodians join together again, asking whether it's right to pay taxes to Caesar, a question intended to place Jesus in a no-win situation. But he outwits them by asking whose head's on the coin. They should give to Caesar what is Caesar's then. But he adds, and also give to God what is God's. Then is the turn of the Sadducees. This group didn't believe in the resurrection, and they seek to ridicule the whole idea. And Jesus tells them they've got it wrong. They don't really understand what resurrection is about, and they don't really understand that God is a God of the living. Then one of the scribes asks him about the greatest commandment. In Mark, this seems to be a genuine question, not a test, as in Matthew. And Jesus and the scribe agree on this point, and Jesus tells him that he's not far from the kingdom of God. And then Jesus himself goes on the attack, denouncing the scribes for always wanting to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, always grabbing the best seats in the synagogues, the places of honour at banquets, and saying long prayers just for show. Mark then states that 2 days before the celebration of Passover, the chief priests and scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus and put him to death, but decided it was best to delay until after the festival. But when Judas comes along with an offer to betray him, they're delighted, and the plot is hatched. And after the supper, Jesus leads a crowd from the chief priests, scribes, and elders, and Jesus is arrested. And after his arrest, Jesus is taken before the Sanhedrin to face charges. This was the supreme religious body, consisting of the high priest, all the chief priests, elders, and scribes assembled together. And finally, the high priest asked Jesus whether he is the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One. So those 2 titles that we saw right at the beginning. And this time, Jesus answers clearly in the affirmative. And this they dramatically interpret as blasphemy and unanimously decree that he should die, and so take him to Pilate. And in the presence of the governor, the chief priests bring many charges against him, and Pilate can see that he's not guilty. But the religious leaders stir up the crowd to ask for the release of a murderer called Barabbas and have Jesus put to death. And finally, as Jesus hangs on the cross, the chief priests and scribes mock him. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe. So it looks as though the opposition has won the day. But one little additional thought. I wonder how Jesus must have felt, knowing that whenever he spoke in public, there were people present who would be quick to be negative, critical, hostile, closed to his message. And that was something he had to live with. So now we look at the little people. It's a name I like to use for the minor characters in Mark's story. They don't really form a group, but are a collection of individuals who have a single encounter with Jesus and then move off stage. But they're very significant players in the gospel drama because they show the qualities of true discipleship. For convenience, I'll speak about them under 3 headings. Firstly, there are a number of people who show great faith at the service of others. Early in the narrative, there's a wonderful story of a group of friends who bring to Jesus a man who's paralysed and who lower him down through the roof and the place where Jesus is teaching, the original drop-in centre, I suppose. These men have great faith, go to remarkable lengths to get him to Jesus, and they're also really good friends. Next, there's the synagogue ruler named Jairus, one of the very few people whose name we get to know. He approaches Jesus and asks him to come and heal his daughter. And whilst on their way, news comes that she's now dead. He needn't bother Jesus anymore. And Jesus tells him to carry on believing. quite a demand, isn't it? And he enters their house and he raises the girl to life. Later, there's the story of the Gentile woman from Syrophoenicia who finds out that Jesus is in town and asks him to heal her daughter who's afflicted with the devil. Jesus at first isn't very keen, since his mission is primarily to his own people, not to the Gentiles. But her faith and her clever repartee win the day, and she gets her wish. Fourthly, there are the friends of the blind man who bring him to Jesus, who cures him in 2 stages. Remember, we referred to that last time. And fifthly, there's a man whose son is suffering from chronic epilepsy, and the disciples aren't able to help. So the man turns to Jesus and says, "If you can, would you heal him?" And Jesus challenges the quality of his faith, and he makes that wonderful statement, "I do believe, Lord, help my unbelief." I suppose is a model for many of us. So that's the first group then. The second group of individuals also show great faith and trust in Jesus, but this time in seeking healing for themselves. Very early in Mark's story, there's the leper who approaches Jesus seeking to be cleansed. He has real faith that Jesus can do so, but isn't sure that he will, given that he's breaking the law. So he says, "If you want to." And Jesus replies, "Of course I want to." And he touches the untouchable as an expression of his compassion. And he's healed, he's cleansed. Then there's the woman suffering from a serious menstrual problem for 12 years. And she comes up behind Jesus in the crowd, believing that touching his cloak would be enough. And it was, and she's cured. But then Jesus demands to meet her face to face. He doesn't like an anonymous healing. And there's a relationship established between them. And finally, there is blind Bartimaeus, whom we met last time too. He persists in his request for healing when people try to put him off. He's confident that Jesus can give him back his sight. And I love this where Jesus said, "Oh, what do you want me to do?" And he said, "I want to see again." And Jesus cures him. And the third group are people who show service and generosity. Firstly, there's Simon's mother-in-law very early in the story, who, when Jesus cures her from a fever, immediately sets about preparing a meal for him and for the others. Practical service. And there are 2 other women in the story who show remarkable generosity, both during the final week of Jesus in Jerusalem. An elderly widow comes to the temple and puts everything she has into the money box of the treasury. And Jesus notices, and he points it out to the disciples, that she has put in all that she had to live on. And then later, when Jesus is at a meal in the house of a former leper called Simon, a woman enters with an alabaster jar of costly ointment, and she breaks the jar and pours all the ointment on his head, and there's nothing left. So these 2 women give everything. And I think their generosity is a prelude to Jesus himself giving everything a few days later on Calvary. I think all these are really beautiful stories, highlighting central aspects of discipleship. And in all this, Jesus comes across as a very kind and compassionate man, but also as remarkably free, as in so many cases he breaks the rules in order to reach out and serve and help. And this brings us to the Passion. This is the climax of the Gospel, a Gospel that's sometimes referred to as a Passion narrative with a long introduction. We concluded our second session on the disciples, dedicated to the 12, with Jesus at the supper predicting the betrayal by Judas, the denials by Peter, and the flight of all of them. So we'll pick up our storyline from there. But firstly, a word of caution. I think most Christians have a good idea of the Passion story, but usually it's a kind of mosaic of different items taken from each of the evangelists. Now, at one level that's fine if it helps us to grow close to Jesus in prayer, but it does mean that maybe we're not aware that actually there are 3 different Passion stories. There's Mark and Matthew, which are very similar, there's Luke, and then there is John. And again, I think we need to remember that the evangelists aren't primarily interested in the details of what happened, but in the meaning of it all. And each has his own points of emphasis. Have you noticed that most Calvary art follows John's version? Jesus is wearing a crown of thorns, his side is pierced, above his head is the inscription INRI, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum, and his mother, the beloved disciple, and Magdalene are at the foot of the cross. But now we are dealing with Mark's version, which is rather different. But it's a really powerful piece of writing. And one of his main theological themes is the isolation, the loneliness of Jesus. Jesus' earlier supper predictions are speedily fulfilled. After the disciples have several times fallen asleep during his agony and prayer in the garden, Judas comes to the place accompanied by a large crowd armed with swords and cudgels, and the man responsible for the success of the arrest is one of those who was singled out to be with him, a friend. And his sign of betrayal is the kiss of friendship and respect. And then every single one of the group takes to their heels in flight, including the youthful follower who narrowly evades capture. Despite their earlier protestations of loyalty, they're not slow to seek their own safety and leave Jesus to face his fate alone. Later, Mark describes the fulfillment of the other prediction of Jesus, the triple denial of the Master by Peter. And he orders the 3 denials in a kind of crescendo pattern, so that the third is the most intense, accompanied by curses and a solemn oath. In fact, some scholars suggest that Peter, still under pressure in spite of the first 2 denials, resorts to the strongest possible manner of dissociating himself from Jesus by actually cursing him. That's the force to be given to that staggering disavowal, I do not know this man you are talking about. Peter opts in public not to be with him. The theme of Jesus' loneliness is continued as the religious leaders in the trial unanimously find him guilty and deserving of death. And then the Jerusalem populace opt for the release of Jesus Barabbas, the murderer, rather than Jesus from Nazareth, and shout that he should be handed over to the hideous torture death of crucifixion. On the cross, he is mocked by the ordinary passers-by, by the soldiery, and then the scribes, and even by the 2 thieves who were crucified with him. There's no good thief, as in Luke's Gospel. And there's no mother or beloved disciple on Calvary. And Magdalene and the other women who are present stand at a distance. And the searing anguish of his pain and loneliness and his failure is focused and captured in that loud cry, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" He dies utterly alone. After the death of the Baptist in Herod's prison, his disciples came and took away his body and buried it in a tomb. In the case of Jesus, this service is performed by a stranger, a non-Galilean Sanhedrin member, a pious, observant Jew who's waiting for the kingdom of God, but not a disciple. And usually these scholars term the burial dishonourable, because according to the law, Jesus is accursed. So there's no washing, no anointing, no lamentation. However, Mark does record two events that accompany the death of Jesus, which are positive and to some extent begin to redress the balance. The first is that the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. So I think this is to be understood firstly as symbolising the future destruction of the temple by the Romans, which had probably taken place by the time Mark's Gospel was written, seen as God's judgment for their rejection of his Messiah. And secondly, more positively, the tearing of the temple veil symbolises, because only the high priest was allowed to go through that once a year, so it symbolises the removal of this barrier between God and humankind. And now everyone has access to a gracious God, the possibility of entering into a new relationship with God, including the Gentiles. And the other major event consists in the response to what has occurred, which is made by the Roman centurion responsible for the execution. The centurion who was standing in front of him had seen how he had died and said, in truth, this man was a son of God. So his reaction stems from what he saw, that verb again. And I think it's crucial that he's brought to this awareness through the death of Jesus. He sees the way he died. Neither the preaching nor the mighty works of Jesus have succeeded in penetrating the blindness and incomprehension of the disciples or the people. Jesus was condemned as the Messianic King of Israel and mocked as such, and it's in that total losing of himself in death, that complete self-gift in the service of others, that his divine sonship and the nature of his messiahship, his deepest reality, are revealed and can be understood. Remember I said that was the plot of the story. But that isn't the end of the story of Jesus, nor the story of the disciples. For when the Sabbath is over, the women who were present at Calvary go on Saturday evening to buy some spices with a view to using them the next morning. And early on that Sunday morning, the first day of the week, after the rising of the sun, lots of symbolism there I think, they make the journey to the tomb in which Jesus was buried. They know where it is because they were present at the burial. And because of the hurried nature of that burial, because it was dishonourable, their intention seems to be to rectify this omission. Presumably they were also motivated by grief and by loving devotion, maybe therefore wanted a sense of closure as well. Seemingly it wasn't unusual in that culture for relatives to visit the grave for 3 days after burial. In fact, mourning was at its height on the third day. But from their action it's clear that they are concerned about a corpse. The possibility of Jesus' resurrection doesn't enter their heads. But on arriving, they find the tomb open, the large stone rolled away already, and the passive verb in the Greek text indicates the action of God. And the women look up and see what God has done. Having moved inside the tomb, they find not the body of Jesus, but a young man in a white robe, the traditional attire of heavenly beings. And he's seated on the right hand, the position of the authoritative teacher. Undoubtedly he's an interpreting angel, a messenger from God. And God's messenger announces the resurrection to the women. After seeking to dispel their fear, the role of the angelic youth is to proclaim the Easter message. Do not be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has been raised. He's not here. Look, There's the place they laid him. So the death of Jesus is not the end of his story. He has been raised. He is not here. His faithful God and Father has not forsaken him, but has vindicated him as Jesus had foretold, dramatically reversing his apparent failure and conquering death. And that startling antithesis and contrast between was crucified, was raised by God is typical of the early charismatic formulas in faith confessions of the early church. You find them a lot in Paul's letters and in the Acts of the Apostles. The insight of the centurion into the true identity of Jesus is confirmed, so that formula rings out like a cry of victory. After this proclamation, the reason why the tomb is empty becomes evident, doesn't it? And now the focus switches to the disciples. Their story hasn't ended either. The women are sent on mission to them, leaving the empty tomb behind. In spite of their failure and their flight, their choice not to be with Jesus, their unwillingness to accept the shame of belonging to him, they are still considered to be his disciples. And in spite of his threefold denial, his sworn emphatically choice no longer to be with Jesus, Peter is singled out for special mention. The risen Lord remains faithful. He's forgiven them. It's quite amazing, isn't it, when you think of it? And he calls them back to him once more in Galilee as promised, the place where it had all begun, where they'd been with him, taught by him, witnessed his mighty deeds, where they'd experienced mission. And there they will see him. The blindness that characterized them throughout the story will then be lifted, to be replaced by seeing the risen Jesus, and the gift of real faith will come to them. Mark's story ends on a puzzling note. The women went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So these women who had remained true and stood by Jesus when all the men failed are now overcome with fear and astonishment, terror and consternation, and they too take flight. Their fear is connected with the appearance and the message of the young man. In the face of God's action, a reaction of fear is not unnatural, a common biblical feature. They can't cope with the experience and the news. But their ongoing silence, their saying nothing, is more problematic. Throughout the gospel, then, men and women have been blind and deaf to the truth about Jesus. And now at the end, when the divine message is delivered to the women, they are struck dumb and they fail to deliver it. They join the other disciples in their failure. They are fragile disciples. Now, Mark and his community are obviously aware that Jesus had, as promised, appeared to his followers. They knew that the church was already spreading far and wide, and they were a living part of that church, celebrating Eucharist regularly. But the issue is why Mark chose to end his story of Jesus so abruptly in this way, without any description of the promised resurrection appearance. So the story ends at verse 8. You'll find in your New Testaments there are stories of resurrection appearances, but they're not from Mark. They were added later by people trying to fill in the gap. What happens is, therefore, some scholars do think that Mark intended to insert a resurrection story, but was prevented either by illness or by his death, and others suggest that the final page of the manuscript was somehow lost. But I think most scholars maintain that it was a deliberate choice of Mark. That's the way he wanted to do it, because he wants to take all initiative away from human beings. He places it with the overspilling goodness, incredible faithfulness, and gratuitous love of God. It's the Father's transforming action which has vindicated the Son's generous and loving self-gift in death. It's the Father's action which has transformed the fearful, failed disciples and brought the Christian community into existence. God is always centre stage. I think Mark's story then challenges you and me, centuries later, to accept Jesus' way of generous self-giving and service. And in all our struggles and failures, he assures us of God's ongoing faithfulness, trustworthiness, and transforming power. By ending as he does, the master stroke of a good storyteller, Mark leaves you and me, his readers, with a decision to make. So thank you for listening over these 3 talks, and I wish you a really happy Advent and Christmas when it comes. And I hope that in the coming liturgical year, you'll be better able to really appreciate the gospel stories on Sundays as they occur. And God bless.